In the autumn of 1929, a factory worker in Moscow reaches into his coat and pulls out a small slip of colored paper. On it, almost nothing. A single color. Purple. That slip is not a ticket, and it is not money. It is the most important object he owns, because it is the only thing that tells him which day is his to rest. His wife carries one too. Hers is yellow, and that small difference in color means that, for weeks at a time, the two of them will not share a single free day. You are looking at the moment a government tried to do something no modern state had seriously attempted before. Not to change a law, not to move a holiday, but to take the week itself, the 7-day rhythm that had ordered human life for thousands of years, and quietly erase it. Two things are worth holding in your mind as we begin. The first is a question of intent. Why would any government go to the deliberate trouble of arranging things so that a husband and wife could almost never rest on the same day? That was not an accident of the plan. That, as the record shows, was closer to the point. And the second is stranger still, because this system worked. It held for roughly 11 years. And then one of the most powerful states on Earth simply stopped, admitted it had been a mistake, and put the old week back. We'll get to why, but not yet. Start with the slip of paper because everything begins there, and because at first it looks almost harmless. The idea was introduced by a man named Yuri Larin, a Bolshevik economist who stood before the Fifth Congress of Soviets in May of 1929 and proposed what he called the nepreryvka, the continuous working week. The record shows his idea was at first almost completely ignored. The president of the Congress did not even mention it in his closing speech. And then within weeks, Joseph Stalin took an interest. And once Stalin took an interest, the same newspapers that had said nothing began to praise it. By the 26th of August, 1929, the Council of People's Commissars had decreed the transition. A further decree on the 24th of September set the length at 5 days. And by around the 1st of October, the change was real. Here is how it worked on the surface. The 7-day week was set aside. In its place, a cycle of 5 days. Every worker was sorted into one of 5 groups, and each group was given a different day to rest. 4 days on, 1 day off, staggered, so that on any given day, 4/5 of the workforce stood at the machines, and 1/5 stayed home. Each group was marked by a color. Yellow, orange, red, purple, green. And that is where the slip of paper comes from. On some of the printed calendars that survive, the groups aren't even marked by color, but by small symbols, a sheaf of wheat, a red star, a hammer and sickle, a book, a soldier's wool cap. The instruction printed at the bottom of one of them is almost gentle. Just remember your color. It says, and you'll always know your rest day. Just remember your color. It sounds like a scheduling quirk, an awkward office rota, scaled up to the size of a country. But watch what happens when you ask the simplest possible question. Not what the system did, but who it was actually for. Because the workers' rest was never really the point. Follow the logic the planners themselves used, and it takes you somewhere colder. The argument, stated plainly at the time, was this. Workers need rest, but machines do not. A factory that closes on Sunday is a factory standing idle 1 day in 7. Multiply that across an entire nation racing through its first 5-year plan, and you have an enormous quantity of expensive, silent machinery doing nothing at all. The staggers solved that. By splitting the workforce into 5 overlapping groups, the machines could run every single day of the year, tended always by the 4/5 who weren't resting. The rest day wasn't a gift to the worker. It was the gap you engineered around him, so that the machine would never have to stop. And that reframing matters because it changes what the colored slip actually is. It is not permission to rest. It is a marker of where you fit inside a continuous mechanism that was designed never to pause. You rest so that the line does not. That part is well documented. But that, too, is only the surface. Because if the goal had simply been to keep machines running, there were other ways to do it. You could rotate shifts within a normal week. You could stagger the hours instead of the days. What the nepreryvka did specifically, deliberately, was to take the one day the whole society had always shared and shatter it into 5. And the day it shattered was Sunday. Consider what a common day of rest actually is. It is not only rest. It is the day people gather. It is the day a congregation fills a church. It is the day families sit at the same table, the day friends meet, the day a community becomes visible to itself. Remove the shared day, and you don't just spread the leisure out. You dissolve the gathering. A church can barely hold a service when only 1/5 of its worshipers are free on any given morning, and a different fifth the next. The record is fairly direct about this. Breaking the collective Sunday was understood as a way to break collective worship, and with it, the social bonds that might one day organize against the state. And people felt it almost immediately. One complaint, printed in Pravda in those early years, put the misery in the plainest possible terms. "What is there for us to do at home?" the writer asked. "If our wife is at the factory, our children are at school, and no one can come to visit us." That is the sound of the plan working exactly as designed. The isolation was not a side effect. It was the mechanism. So the slip of paper turns again in your hand. First it looked like a rota, then it looked like a gear inside an industrial machine. Now it looks like something else entirely. An instrument, small enough to fit in a pocket, for quietly taking apart the ways people came together. A government had reached past the factory and into the calendar itself, and it was using the week as a tool. And here is the detail that is easy to miss, the one that tells you how careful this was. The Soviet planners did not do what the French revolutionaries had done more than a century earlier. The French had thrown out the entire calendar, renamed the months, rebuilt the year from nothing. The Soviet system didn't bother. The days kept their old names. Monday was still Monday. What changed was underneath. The rhythm of when you worked and when you stopped was quietly unhooked from the 7-day cycle, while the surface of that cycle was left standing in place. It was less a new calendar than a subtraction performed on the old one. You could still say the word Sunday. It simply no longer meant the thing it used to mean. For a while, the state could point to numbers and call it a triumph. Whether it truly raised production, though, is a question historians still argue over. Output did climb in these years, but a good deal of that climb came from something the calendar could take no credit for: more people simply entering the workforce. Factories were swelling with new hands regardless of what the week looked like. Strip that away, and the picture of the continuous week's real efficiency grows much harder to read. The triumph, in other words, may have been borrowed. And then the cracks began to show. They showed first in the one thing the whole system had been built to protect: the machines. Because the premise had a flaw hidden inside it, and it was a flaw the planners had said out loud without ever hearing. Workers need rest, but machines do not. That was the slogan. It was also wrong. A machine that runs every day of the year, with no shared day on which it can be shut down, cleaned, and repaired, does not run forever. It wears. It breaks. A report from 1931 put it bluntly. Factories were finding that machines which never got their weekly stop began to break down and wear out at an alarming rate. The system built to keep the machines running was quietly destroying them, and there was a subtler failure underneath even that one. When every worker rested on a different day, no single worker was ever fully responsible for a single machine. On your rest day, someone else stood at your station. On theirs, you stood at yours. Everyone's machine, in the end, became no one's machine. The tools were shared into neglect. The thing that belonged to everyone was looked after by no one. Then there was the part of the country that never really agreed to the experiment at all. Out in the villages, among the farmers, the elaborate machinery of colors and staggered days landed on ground that had never worked to a factory week in the first place. Rural life already ran every day. There were no purple rest days on a farm, no fifth-day stagger among the fields. Officials complained, in 1931, that the rural population remained stubbornly tied to its old habits. A government had rewritten time for its factories, and a very large share of its own people simply carried on as before. And then there was Sunday itself, which refused to die. Even at the height of the system, with the shared weekend legally dissolved, people kept the word and kept the day. Workers given a rest day by color would often quietly take that day, and take Sunday as well. The old rhythm did not vanish when the decree was signed. It went underground, and it waited. By the summer of 1931, the pressure was surfacing at the very top. In June, Stalin himself gave a speech, and the man who had championed the continuous week now complained that some comrades had been hasty, that the system had been distorted into what he called a state of lack of personal responsibility. It is a remarkable thing to hear a government begin, in its own words, to back away from its own invention. The response was to change the machine again. The 5-day stagger gave way to a 6-day week, the nepreryvka, and this time, crucially, everyone rested on the same day once more. The rest days were fixed to the calendar. The 6th, the 12th, the 18th, the 24th, and the 30th of each month. The shared day was cautiously coming back, though still not on Sunday and still not on the ordinary week. Even that was uneven. Years into it, by the mid-1930s, only about 3/4 of industrial workers had moved to the newer schedules, while the rest were still on the old continuous stagger. The country had spent half a decade unable to fully agree with itself on what a week even was. And then on the 26th of June, 1940, a decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet quietly ended the entire experiment. The 7-day week was restored. Sunday returned as the common day of rest. After roughly 11 years, the oldest rhythm reasserted itself, put back in place by the same kind of authority that had once tried to remove it. By the mainstream account, the whole interruption can even be traced to a single ordinary Sunday. The 29th of September, 1929. The last normal Sunday the urban Soviet worker would know for more than a decade. But the restoration came with a shadow of its own, and it is worth naming plainly rather than dramatizing. The same tightening state that gave Sunday back also, in that same period, made it a criminal matter to be late for work or to miss a day. Being more than a short stretch of minutes late could carry a real punishment. The week was returned. The grip that had tried to remake it did not loosen. The calendar changed back. The thing behind the calendar did not. So what do you make of it in the end? A government looked at the 7-day week, one of the few structures shared across nearly every civilization on Earth, older than the state that challenged it, and decided it was an inefficiency to be corrected. It had the power to print the calendars, to sort millions of people into colors, to dissolve the shared day, and hand each worker a slip of paper in its place. And for a decade, on paper, it succeeded. What it could not do was change the thing underneath. The machines needed their shared day. The villages kept their own time. The word Sunday stayed in people's mouths, and the day stayed in their habits, until the state that had tried to erase it gave up and wrote it back into law. Which returns us at the last to that worker in 1929, the small purple slip in his coat, and a wife whose slip is yellow. The two of them sorted on at different days, so that the machine behind them would never have to rest. He could not have known that the thing he was holding was an early edition of an idea that keeps returning, in different forms, the idea that time itself is something a sufficiently powerful authority might own and schedule and redraw. He only knew that his rest day was purple, and hers was yellow, and that the calendar had decided when they were allowed to be in the same room. The 7-day week outlasted the men who tried to erase it. That much the record is clear about. What is harder to answer is the question the little colored slip leaves sitting in your hand. Not whether a government can rewrite the week, because for 11 years one did, but whether the next one to try will be as willing in the end to give it back.